On the Wednesday, she was to receive another letter. She had resolved to let her father see the arrival of this one, be the consequences what they might. The dread of losing her lover by this deed of honesty prevented her acting upon the resolve. 5 minutes before the postman's expected arrival, she slipped out and down the lane to meet him. She met him immediately upon turning a sharp angle, which hid her from view in the direction of the vicarage. The man smilingly handed one missive, and was going on to hand another, a circular from some tradesman. "No," she said, "take that on to the house."
"Why, miss, you're doing what your father has done for the last fortnight."
She did not comprehend.
"Why, come to this corner, and take a letter of me every morning, all written the same handwriting, and letting any others for him go on to the house."
And on the postman went. No sooner had he turned the corner behind her back than she heard her father meet and address the man. She had saved her letter by 2 minutes. Her father audibly went through precisely the same performance as she had just been guilty of herself. This stealthy conduct of his was, to say the least, peculiar. Given an impulsive, inconsequent girl, neglected as to her inner life by her only parent, and the following forces alive within her, to determine a resultant. First love, acted upon by a deadly fear of separation from its object. Inexperience, guiding onward a frantic wish to prevent the above-named issue. Misgivings as to propriety, met by hope of ultimate exoneration. Indignation at parental inconsistency, in first encouraging, then forbidding. A chilling sense of disobedience, overpowered by a conscientious inability to brook a breaking of plighted faith with a man who, in essentials, had remained unaltered from the beginning. A blessed hope that opposition would turn an erroneous judgment. A bright faith that things would mend thereby and wind up well. Probably the result would, after all, have been nil, had not the following few remarks been made one day at breakfast. Her father was in his old hearty spirits. He smiled to himself at stories too bad to tell, and called Elfriede a little scamp for surreptitiously preserving some blind kittens that ought to have been drowned. After this expression, she said to him suddenly, "If Mr. Smith had been already in the family, you would not have been made wretched by discovering he had poor relations?"
"Do you mean in the family by marriage?" he replied inattentively, and continuing to peel his egg. The accumulating scarlet told that was her meaning, as much as the affirmative reply. "I should have put up with it, no doubt," Mr. Swancourt observed.
"So that you would not have been driven into hopeless melancholy, but have made the best of him." Elfriede's erratic mind had from her youth upwards been constantly in the habit of perplexing her father by hypothetical questions, based on absurd conditions. The present seemed to be cast so precisely in the mould of previous ones that, not being given to synthesis of circumstances, he answered it with customary complacency.
"If he were allied to us irretrievably, of course I, or any sensible man, should accept conditions that could not be altered. Certainly not be hopelessly melancholy about it. I don't believe anything in the world would make me hopelessly melancholy, and don't let anything make you so either."
"I won't, Papa," she cried, with a serene brightness that pleased him. Certainly Mr. Swancourt must have been far from thinking that the brightness came from an exhilarating intention to hold back no longer from the mad action she had planned. In the evening he drove away towards Stratley quite alone. It was an unusual course for him. At the door, Elfriede had been again almost impelled by her feelings to pour out all. "Why are you going to Stratley, Papa?" she said, and looked at him longingly.
"I will tell you tomorrow when I come back," he said cheerily. "Not before then, Elfried. Thou wilt not utter what thou dost not know, and so far will I trust thee, gentle Elfried."
She was repressed and hurt. "I will tell you my errand to Plymouth too, when I come back," she murmured. He went away. His jocularity made her intention seem the lighter, as his indifference made her more resolved to do as she liked. It was a familiar September sunset, dark blue fragments of cloud upon an orange-yellow sky. These sunsets used to tempt her to walk towards them, as any beautiful thing tempts a near approach. She went through the field to the privet hedge, clambered into the middle of it, and reclined upon the thick boughs. After looking westward for a considerable time, she blamed herself for not looking eastward to where Stephen was, and turned round. Ultimately, her eyes fell upon the ground. A peculiarity was observable beneath her. A green field spread itself on each side of the hedge, one belonging to the glebe, the other being a part of the land attached to the manor house adjoining. On the vicarage side, she saw a little footpath, the distinctive and altogether exceptional feature of which consisted in its being only about 10 yards long. It terminated abruptly at each end. A footpath, suddenly beginning and suddenly ending, coming from nowhere and leading nowhere, she had never seen before. Yes, she had, on second thoughts. She had seen exactly such a path trodden in the front of barracks by the sentry. And this recollection explained the origin of the path here. Her father had trodden it by pacing up and down, as she had once seen him doing. Sitting on the hedge as she sat now, her eyes commanded a view of both sides of it, and a few minutes later Elfried looked over to the manor side. Here was another sentry path. It was like the first in length, and it began and ended exactly opposite the beginning and ending of its neighbour, but it was thinner and less distinct. 2 reasons existed for the difference. This one might have been trodden by a similar weight of tread to the other, exercised a less number of times, or it might have been walked just as frequently. Probably, a gentleman from Scotland Yard, had he been passing at the time, might have considered the latter alternative as the more probable. Elfried thought otherwise, so far as she thought at all. But her own great tomorrow was now imminent. All thoughts inspired by casual sights of the eye were only allowed to exercise themselves in inferior corners of her brain, previously to being banished altogether. Elfried was at length compelled to reason practically upon her undertaking. All her definite perceptions thereon, when the emotion accompanying them was abstracted, amounted to no more than these. Say, 1 hour and 3/4 to ride to St. Launce's. Say, half an hour at the Falcon to change my dress. Say, 2 hours waiting for some train and getting to Plymouth. Say, 1 hour to spare before 12 o'clock. Total time from leaving Endlestowe till 12 o'clock, 5 hours. Therefore, I shall have to start at 7. No surprise, or sense of unwontedness, entered the minds of the servants at her early ride. The monotony of life we associate with people of small incomes in districts out of the sound of the railway whistle has one exception, which puts into shade the experience of dwellers about the great centres of population, that is, in travelling. Every journey there is more or less an adventure. Adventurous hours are necessarily chosen for the most commonplace outing. Miss Elfried had to leave early. That was all. Elfried never went out on horseback, but she brought home something. Something found or something bought. If she trotted to town or village, her burden was books. If to hills, woods, or the seashore, it was wonderful mosses, abnormal twigs, a handkerchief of wet shells or seaweed. Once, in muddy weather, when Pansy was walking with her down the streets of Castle Bottrell on a fair day, a packet in front of her and a packet under her arm, an accident befell the packets, and they slipped down. On one side of her, 3 volumes of fiction lay kissing the mud. On the other, numerous skeins of polychromatic wools lay absorbing it. Unpleasant women smiled through windows at the mishap. The men all looked round, and a boy, who was minding a gingerbread stall whilst the owner had gone to get drunk, laughed loudly. The blue eyes turned to sapphires, and the cheeks crimsoned with vexation. After that misadventure, she set her wits to work, and was ingenious enough to invent an arrangement of small straps about the saddle, by which a great deal could be safely carried thereon, in a small compass. Here she now spread out and fastened a plain dark walking dress and a few other trifles of apparel. Worm opened the gate for her, and she vanished away. One of the brightest mornings of late summer shone upon her. The heather was at its purplest, the furze at its yellowest, the grasshoppers chirped loud enough for birds, the snakes hissed like little engines, and Elfriede at first felt lively. Sitting at ease upon Pansy, in her orthodox riding habit and nondescript hat, she looked what she felt. But the Mercury of those days had a trick of falling unexpectedly. First, only for 1 minute in 10, had she a sense of depression. Then a large cloud, that had been hanging in the north like a black fleece, came and placed itself between her and the sun. It helped on what was already inevitable, and she sank into a uniformity of sadness. She turned in the saddle and looked back. They were now on an open tableland, whose altitude still gave her a view of the sea by Endlestowe. She looked longingly at that spot. During this little revulsion of feeling, Pansy had been still advancing, and Elfriede felt it would be absurd to turn her little mare's head the other way. Still, she thought, if I had a mamma at home, I would go back. And making one of those stealthy movements by which women let their hearts juggle with their brains, she did put the horse's head about, as if unconsciously, and went at a hand gallop towards home for more than a mile. By this time, from the inveterate habit of valuing what we have renounced directly the alternative is chosen, the thought of her forsaken Stephen recalled her, and she turned about and cantered on to St. Launce's again. This miserable strife of thought now began to rage in all its wildness. Overwrought and trembling, she dropped the rein upon Pansy's shoulders and vowed she would be led whither the horse would take her. Pansy slackened her pace to a walk, and walked on with her agitated burden for 3 or 4 minutes. At the expiration of this time, they had come to a little byway on the right, leading down a slope to a pool of water. The pony stopped, looked towards the pool, and then advanced and stooped to drink. Elfriede looked at her watch, and discovered that if she were going to reach St. Launce's early enough to change her dress at the Falcon and get a chance of some early train to Plymouth, there were only 2 available. It was necessary to proceed at once. She was impatient. It seemed as if Pansy would never stop drinking, and the repose of the pool, the idle motions of the insects and flies upon it, the placid waving of the flags, the leaf skeletons, like Genoese filigree, placidly sleeping at the bottom, by their contrast with her own turmoil, made her impatience greater. Pansy did turn at last, and went up the slope again to the high road. The pony came upon it and stood crosswise, looking up and down. Elfriede's heart throbbed erratically, and she thought, horses, if left to themselves, make for where they are best fed. Pansy will go home.
Pansy turned and walked on towards St. Launce's. Pansy at home, during summer, had little but grass to live on. After a run to St. Launce's, she always had a feed of corn to support her on the return journey. Therefore, being now more than halfway, she preferred St. Launce's. But Elfride did not remember this now. All she cared to recognise was a dreamy fancy that today's rash action was not her own. She was disabled by her moods, and it seemed indispensable to adhere to the programme. So strangely involved are motives that, more than by her promise to Stephen, more even than by her love, she was forced on by a sense of the necessity of keeping faith with herself, as promised in the inane vow of 10 minutes ago. She hesitated no longer. Pansy went like the steed of Adonis, as if she told the steps. Presently the quaint gables and jumbled roofs of St. Launce's were spread beneath her, and going down the hill, she entered the courtyard of the Falcon. Mrs. Buckle, the landlady, came to the door to meet her. The swan courts were well known here. The transition from equestrian to the ordinary guise of railway travellers had been more than once performed by father and daughter in this establishment. In less than a quarter of an hour, Elfride emerged from the door in her walking dress and went to the railway. She had not told Mrs. Buckle anything as to her intentions, and was supposed to have gone out shopping. An hour and 40 minutes later, and she was in Stephen's arms at the Plymouth station. Not upon the platform, in the secret retreat of a deserted waiting-room. Stephen's face boded ill. He was pale and despondent.
"What's the matter?"
she asked.
"We cannot be married here today, my Elfie. I ought to have known it and stayed here. In my ignorance I did not. I have the licence, but it can only be used in my parish in London. I only came down last night, as you know."
"What shall we do?" she said blankly.
"There's only one thing we can do, darling."
"What's that?"
"Go on to London, by a train just starting, and be married there tomorrow." "Passengers for the 11:05 up train, take their seats," said a guard's voice on the platform.
"Will you go, Elfride?"
"I will."
In 3 minutes the train had moved off, bearing away with it Stephen and Elfride. But by lighter feet. Chapter 12. Adieu, she cries, and waved her lily hand. The few tattered clouds of the morning enlarged and united. The sun withdrew behind them to emerge no more that day, and the evening drew to a close in drifts of rain. The water drops beat like duckshot against the window of the railway carriage containing Stephen and Elfride. The journey from Plymouth to Paddington, by even the most headlong express, allows quite enough leisure for passion of any sort to cool. Elfride's excitement had passed off, and she sat in a kind of stupor during the latter half of the journey. She was aroused by the clanging of the maze of rails over which they traced their way at the entrance to the station.
"Is this London?" she said.
"Yes, darling,"
said Stephen, in a tone of assurance he was far from feeling. To him, no less than to her, the reality so greatly differed from the prefiguring. She peered out, as well as the window beaded with drops would allow her, and saw only the lamps which had just been lit, blinking in the wet atmosphere, and rows of hideous zinc chimney pipes in dim relief against the sky. She writhed uneasily, as when a thought is swelling in the mind which must cause much pain at its deliverance in words. Elfride had known no more about the stings of evil report than the native wildfowl knew of the effects of Crusoe's first shot. Now she saw a little further, and a little further still. The train stopped.
Stephen relinquished the soft hand he had held all the day and proceeded to assist her onto the platform. This act of alighting upon strange ground seemed all that was wanted to complete a resolution within her. She looked at her betrothed with despairing eyes.
"Oh, Stephen," she exclaimed, "I am so miserable. I must go home again. I must. I must. Forgive my wretched vacillation. I don't like it here, nor myself, nor you."
Stephen looked bewildered and did not speak.
"Will you allow me to go home?" she implored. "I won't trouble you to go with me. I will not be any weight upon you. Only say you will agree to my returning, that you will not hate me for it, Stephen. It is better that I should return again. Indeed it is, Stephen."
"But we can't return now," he said, in a deprecatory tone.
"I must. I will."
"How? When do you want to go?"
"Now. Can we go at once?"
The lad looked hopelessly along the platform.
"If you must go, and think it wrong to remain, dearest," said he sadly, "you shall. You shall do whatever you like, my Elfriede. But would you in reality rather go now, than stay till tomorrow and go as my wife?"
"Yes, yes, much. Anything to go now. I must, she cried.
"We ought to have done one of two things," he answered gloomily. "Never to have started, or not to have returned without being married. I don't like to say it, Elfriede, indeed I don't, but you must be told this, that going back unmarried may compromise your good name in the eyes of people who may hear of it."
"They will not, and I must go."
"Oh, Elfriede, I am to blame for bringing you away."
"Not at all. I am the elder."
"By a month, and what's that? But never mind that now." He looked around. "Is there a train for Plymouth tonight?" he inquired of a guard. The guard passed on and did not speak.
"Is there a train for Plymouth tonight?"
said Elfriede to another.
"Yes, miss. The 8:10 leaves in 10 minutes. You've come to the wrong platform. It is the other side. Change at Bristol into the night mail. Down that staircase and under the line."
They ran down the staircase, Elfriede first, to the booking office, and into a carriage with an official standing beside the door.
"Show your tickets, please."
They are locked in. Men about the platform accelerate their velocities till they fly up and down like shuttles in a loom. A whistle, the waving of a flag, a human cry, a steam groan, and away they go to Plymouth again, just catching these words as they glide off.
"Those two youngsters had a near run for it, and no mistake."
Elfriede found her breath.
"And have you come too, Stephen? Why did you?"
"I shall not leave you till I see you safe at St. Launce's. Do not think worse of me than I am, Elfriede."
And then they rattled along through the night, back again by the way they had come. The weather cleared, and the stars shone in upon them. Their 2 or 3 fellow passengers sat most of the time with closed eyes. Stephen sometimes slept. Elfriede alone was wakeful and palpitating, hour after hour. The day began to break, and revealed that they were by the sea. Red rocks overhung them, and, receding into distance, grew livid in the blue-grey atmosphere. The sun rose and sent penetrating shafts of light in upon their weary faces. Another hour, and the world began to be busy. They waited yet a little, and the train slackened its speed in view of the platform at St. Launce's. She shivered and mused sadly.
"I did not see all the consequences," she said. "Appearances are woefully against me. If anybody finds me out, I am, I suppose, disgraced."
"Then appearances will speak falsely.
And how can that matter, even if they do? I shall be your husband sooner or later for certain, and so prove your purity.
Stephen, once in London, I ought to have married you, she said firmly. It was my only safe defence. I see more things now than I did yesterday. My only remaining chance is not to be discovered, and that we must fight for most desperately. They stepped out. Elfriede pulled a thick veil over her face. A woman with red and scaly eyelids and glistening eyes was sitting on a bench just inside the office door. She fixed her eyes upon Elfriede with an expression whose force it was impossible to doubt, but the meaning of which was not clear. Then upon the carriage they had left. She seemed to read a sinister story in the scene. Elfriede shrank back and turned the other way.
"Who is that woman?" said Stephen. "She looked hard at you."
"Mrs. Jethway, a widow, and a mother of that young man whose tomb we sat on the other night. Stephen, she is my enemy. Would that God had had mercy enough upon me to have hidden this from her."
"Do not talk so hopelessly," he remonstrated. "I don't think she recognised us."
"I pray that she did not."
He put on a more vigorous mood.
"Now, we will go and get some breakfast."
"No, no," she begged. "I cannot eat. I must get back to Endlestow."
Elfriede was as if she had grown years older than Stephen now.
"But you've had nothing since last night but that cup of tea at Bristol."
"I can't eat, Stephen."
"Wine and biscuit?"
"No."
"Nor tea nor coffee?"
"No."
"A glass of water?"
"No. I want something that makes people strong and energetic for the present, that borrows the strength of tomorrow for use today, leaving tomorrow without any at all for that matter, or even that would take all life away tomorrow, so long as it enabled me to get home again now. Brandy, that's what I want. That woman's eyes have eaten my heart away."
"You are wild, and you grieve me, darling. Must it be brandy?"
"Yes, if you please."
"How much?"
"I don't know. I've never drunk more than a teaspoonful at once. All I know is that I want it. Don't get it at the Falcon."
He left her in the fields and went to the nearest inn in that direction. Presently he returned, with a small flask nearly full, and some slices of bread and butter, thin as wafers in a paper bag. Elfriede took a sip or two.
"It goes into my eyes," she said wearily. "I can't take any more. Yes, I will. I will close my eyes. Ah, it goes to them by an inside route. I don't want it. Throw it away."
However, she could eat, and did eat. Her chief attention was concentrated upon how to get the horse from the Falcon stables without suspicion. Stephen was not allowed to accompany her into the town. She acted now upon conclusions reached without any aid from him. His power over her seemed to have departed.
"You had better not be seen with me, even here, where I am so little known. We have begun as stealthily as thieves, and we must end stealthily as thieves, at all hazards. Until Papa has been told by me myself, a discovery would be terrible."
Walking and gloomily talking thus, they waited till nearly 9 o'clock, at which time Elfriede thought she might call at the Falcon without creating much surprise. Behind the railway station was the river, spanned by an old Tudor bridge, whence the road diverged in two directions, one skirting the suburbs of the town and winding round again into the high road to Endlestow. Beside this road Stephen sat and awaited her return from the Falcon. He sat as one sitting for a portrait, motionless, watching the checkered lights and shades on the tree trunks, the children playing opposite the school, previous to entering for the morning lesson, and the reapers in a field afar off.
The certainty of possession had not come, and there was nothing to mitigate the youth's gloom, that increased with the thought of the parting now so near. At length she came trotting round to him, in appearance much as on the romantic morning of their visit to the cliff, but shorn of the radiance which glistened about her then. However, her comparative immunity from further risk and trouble had considerably composed her. Elfride's capacity for being wounded was only surpassed by her capacity for healing, which, rightly or wrongly, is by some considered an index of transientness of feeling in general.
Elfride, what did they say at the Falcon?
Nothing. Nobody seemed curious about me. They knew I went to Plymouth, and I have stayed there a night now and then with Miss Bicknell. I rather calculated upon that.
And now parting arose, like a death, to these children, for it was imperative that she should start at once. Stephen walked beside her for nearly a mile. During the walk he said sadly,
Elfride, 24 hours have passed, and the thing is not done.
But you have ensured that it shall be done.
How have I?
Oh, Stephen! You ask how? Do you think I could marry another man on earth, having gone thus far with you? Have I not shown beyond possibility of doubt that I can be nobody else's? Have I not irretrievably committed myself? Pride has stood for nothing in the face of my great love. You misunderstood my turning back, and I cannot explain it. It was wrong to go with you at all. And though it would have been worse to go further, it would have been better policy, perhaps. Be assured of this, that whenever you have a home for me, however poor and humble, and come and claim me, I am ready, she added bitterly. When my father knows of this day's work, he may be only too glad to let me go.
Perhaps he may then insist upon our marriage at once,
Stephen answered, seeing a ray of hope in the very focus of her remorse.
I hope he may, even if we had still to part till I am ready for you as we intended.
Elfride did not reply.
You don't seem the same woman, Elfie, that you were yesterday.
Nor am I. But goodbye. Go back now.
And she reined the horse for parting.
Oh, Stephen, she cried, I feel so weak. I don't know how to meet him. Cannot you, after all, come back with me?
Shall I come?
Elfride paused to think.
No, it will not do. It is my utter foolishness that makes me say such words. But he will send for you.
Say to him, continued Stephen, that we did this in the absolute despair of our minds. Tell him we don't wish him to favour us, only to deal justly with us. If he says marry now, so much the better. If not, say that all may be put right by his promise to allow me to have you when I am good enough for you, which may be soon. Say, I have nothing to offer him in exchange for his treasure, the more sorry I. But all the love, and all the life, and all the labour of an honest man shall be yours. As to when this had better be told, I'll leave you to judge.
His words made her cheerful enough to toy with her position.
And if ill report should come, Stephen, she said, smiling, why, the orange tree must save me, as it saved virgins in St. George's time from the poisonous breath of the dragon. There, forgive me for forwardness. I am going.
Then the boy and girl beguiled themselves with words of half-parting only.
Own wifey, God bless you till we meet again.
Till we meet again. Goodbye.
And the pony went on, and she spoke to him no more. He saw her figure diminish, and her blue veil grow grey. saw it with the agonizing sensations of a slow death. After thus parting from a man than whom she had known none greater as yet, Elfride rode rapidly onwards, a tear being occasionally shaken from her eyes into the road. What yesterday had seemed so desirable, so promising, even trifling, had now acquired the complexion of a tragedy. She saw the rocks and sea in the neighbourhood of Endlestowe and heaved a sigh of relief. When she passed a field behind the vicarage, she heard the voices of Unity and William Worm. They were hanging a carpet upon a line. Unity was uttering a sentence that concluded with, "When Miss Elfride comes." "When do you expect her?" "Not till evening now. She's safe enough at Miss Bicknell's, bless ye." Elfride went round to the door. She did not knock or ring, and seeing nobody to take the horse, Elfride led her round to the yard, slipped off the bridle and saddle, drove her towards the paddock, and turned her in. Then Elfride crept indoors and looked into all the ground-floor rooms. Her father was not there. On the mantelpiece of the drawing-room stood a letter addressed to her in his handwriting. She took it and read it as she went upstairs to change her habit.
Stratley, Thursday. Dear Elfride, on second thoughts I will not return today, but only come as far as Wadcombe. I shall be home by tomorrow afternoon and bring a friend with me. Yours in haste, C.S.
After making a quick toilet, she felt more revived, though still suffering from a headache. On going out of the door, she met Unity at the top of the stair. "Oh, Miss Elfride," I said to myself, "'tis her spirit. We didn't dream of you not coming home last night. You didn't say anything about staying." "I intended to come home the same evening, but altered my plan. I wished I hadn't afterwards. Papa will be angry, I suppose." "Better not tell him, miss," said Unity. "I do fear to," she murmured. "Unity, would you just begin telling him when he comes home?" "What, and get you into trouble?" "I deserve it." "No, indeed I won't," said Unity. "It is not such a mighty matter, Miss Elfride. I says to myself, Master's taking a holiday, and because he's not been kind lately to Miss Elfride, she is imitating him. Well, do as you like. And will you now bring me some luncheon?" After satisfying an appetite, which the fresh marine air had given her, in its victory over an agitated mind, she put on her hat and went to the garden and summer-house. She sat down and leant with her head in a corner. Here she fell asleep. Half awake, she hurriedly looked at the time. She had been there 3 hours. At the same moment she heard the outer gate swing together, and wheels sweep round the entrance, some prior noise from the same source having probably been the cause of her awaking. Next, her father's voice was heard, calling to Worm. Elfride passed along a walk towards the house behind a belt of shrubs. She heard a tongue holding converse with her father, which was not that of either of the servants. Her father and the stranger were laughing together. Then there was a rustling of silk, and Mr. Swancourt and his companion, or companions, to all seeming, entered the door of the house, for nothing more of them was audible. Elfride had turned back to meditate on what friends these could be, when she heard footsteps, and her father exclaiming behind her,
"Oh, Elfride, here you are. I hope you got on well."
Elfride's heart smote her, and she did not speak.
"Come back to the summer-house a minute," continued Mr. Swancourt. "I have to tell you of that I promised to."
They entered the summer-house and stood leaning over the knotty woodwork of the balustrade.
"Now," said her father radiantly, "guess what I have to say."
He seemed to be regarding his own existence so intently that he took no interest in, nor even saw, the complexion of hers. I cannot, Papa, she said sadly.
Try, dear.
I would rather not, indeed.
You are tired. You look worn. The ride was too much for you. Well, this is what I went away for. I went to be married.
Married? She faltered, and could hardly check an involuntary, so did I. A moment after, and her resolve to confess perished like a bubble.
Yes. To whom do you think? Mrs. Troyton, the new owner of the estate over the hedge and of the old manor house. It was only finally settled between us when I went to Stratley a few days ago.
He lowered his voice to a sly tone of merriment.
Now, as to your stepmother, you'll find she is not much to look at, though a good deal to listen to. She is 6 years older than myself, for one thing.
You forget that I know her. She called here once, after we had been to her, and found her away from home.
Of course, of course. Well, whatever her looks are, she's as excellent a woman as ever breathed. She has had lately left her, as absolute property, 3,500 a year, besides the devise of this estate, and, by the way, a large legacy came to her in satisfaction of dower, as it is called.
3,500 a year?
And a large, well, a fair-sized mansion in town, and a pedigree as long as my walking stick, though that bears evidence of being rather a raked-up affair. Done since the family got rich. People do those things now, as they build ruins on maiden estates and cast antiques at Birmingham.
Elfriede merely listened, and said nothing. He continued more quietly and impressively.
Yes, Elfriede, she is wealthy, in comparison with us, though with few connections. However, she will introduce you to the world a little. We are going to exchange her house in Baker Street for one at Kensington for your sake. Everybody is going there now, she says. At Easter's, we shall fly to town for the usual 3 months. I shall have a curate, of course, by that time. Elfriede, I am past love, you know, and I honestly confess that I married her for your sake. Why a woman of her standing should have thrown herself away upon me, God knows. But I suppose her age and plainness were too pronounced for a town man. With your good looks, if you now play your cards well, you may marry anybody. Of course a little contrivance will be necessary, but there's nothing to stand between you and a husband with a title that I can see. Lady Luxellian was only a squire's daughter. Now, don't you see how foolish the old fancy was? But come, she is indoors waiting to see you. It is as good as a play, too, continued the vicar, as they walked towards the house. I courted her through the privet hedge yonder. Not entirely, you know, but we used to walk there of an evening. Nearly every evening, at last. But I needn't tell you details now. Everything was terribly matter-of-fact, I assure you. At last, that day I saw her at Stratley, we determined to settle it offhand.
And you never said a word to me, replied Elfriede, not reproachfully either in tone or thought. Indeed, her feeling was the very reverse of reproachful. She felt relieved and even thankful. Where confidence had not been given, how could confidence be expected? Her father mistook her dispassionateness for a veil of politeness over a sense of ill usage.
I am not altogether to blame, he said. There were 2 or 3 reasons for secrecy. One was the recent death of her relative, the testator, though that did not apply to you. But remember, Elfriede, he continued in a stiffer tone, you had mixed yourself up so foolishly with those low people, the Smiths. and it was just, too, when Mrs. Troyton and myself were beginning to understand each other, that I resolved to say nothing, even to you. How did I know how far you had gone with them and their son? You might have made a point of taking tea with them every day, for all that I knew.
Elfriede swallowed her feelings as she best could, and languidly, though flatly, asked a question. "Did you kiss Mrs. Troyton on the lawn about 3 weeks ago? That evening I came into the study and found you had just had candles in."
Mr. Swancourt looked rather red and abashed, as middle-aged lovers are apt to do when caught in the tricks of younger ones. "Well, yes, I think I did," he stammered. "Just to please her, you know." And then, recovering himself, he laughed heartily.
"And was this what your Horatian quotation referred to?"
"It was, Elfriede." They stepped into the drawing-room from the veranda. At that moment Mrs. Swancourt came downstairs and entered the same room by the door. "Here, Charlotte, is my little Elfriede," said Mr. Swancourt, with the increased affection of tone often adopted towards relations when newly produced. Poor Elfriede, not knowing what to do, did nothing at all, but stood receptive of all that came to her by sight, hearing, and touch. Mrs. Swancourt moved forward, took her stepdaughter's hand, then kissed her. "Ah, darling," she exclaimed good-humouredly, "you didn't think, when you showed a strange old woman over the conservatory a month or 2 ago, and explained the flowers to her so prettily, that she would so soon be here in new colours? Nor did she, I am sure." The new mother had been truthfully enough described by Mr. Swancourt. She was not physically attractive. She was dark, very dark in complexion, portly in figure, and with a plentiful residuum of hair in the proportion of 6 white ones to 6 black ones, though the latter were black indeed. No further observed, she was not a woman to like. But there was more to see. To the most superficial critic, it was apparent that she made no attempt to disguise her age. She looked 60 at the first glance, and close acquaintanceship never proved her older. Another, and still more winning trait, was one attaching to the corners of her mouth. Before she made a remark, these often twitched gently, not backwards and forwards, the index of nervousness, not down upon the jaw, the sign of determination, but palpably upwards, in precisely the curve adopted to represent mirth in the broad caricatures of schoolboys. Only this element in her face was expressive of anything within the woman, but it was unmistakable. It expressed humour, subjective as well as objective, which could survey the peculiarities of self in as whimsical a light as those of other people. This is not all of Mrs. Swancourt. She had held out to Elfriede hands whose fingers were literally stiff with rings. Signes oroque rigentes, like Helen's robe. These rows of rings were not worn in vanity, apparently. They were mostly antique and dull, though a few were the reverse. Right hand. First, plainly set oval onyx, representing a devil's head. Second, green jasper intaglio, with red veins. Third, entirely gold, bearing figure of a hideous griffin. Fourth, a sea-green monster diamond, with small diamonds round it. Fifth, antique cornelian intaglio of dancing figure of a satyr. Sixth, an angular band chased with dragons' heads. Seventh, a faceted carbuncle, accompanied by 10 little twinkling emeralds. Left hand,
First, a reddish-yellow toadstone. Second, a heavy ring enamelled in colours and bearing a jacinth. Third, an amethystine sapphire. Fourth, a polished ruby surrounded by diamonds. Fifth, the engraved ring of an abbess. Sixth, a gloomy intaglio. Beyond this rather quaint array of stone and metal, Mrs. Swancourt wore no ornament whatever. Elfride had been favourably impressed with Mrs. Troyton at their meeting about 2 months earlier, but to be pleased with a woman as a momentary acquaintance was different from being taken with her as a stepmother. However, the suspension of feeling was but for a moment. Elfride decided to like her still. Mrs. Swancourt was a woman of the world as to knowledge, the reverse as to action, as her marriage suggested. Elfride and the lady were soon inextricably involved in conversation, and Mr. Swancourt left them to themselves. "And what do you find to do with yourself here?" Mrs. Swancourt said, after a few remarks about the wedding. "You ride, I know."
"Yes, I ride, but not much, because Papa doesn't like my going alone."
"Well, you must have somebody to look after you."
"I read, and write a little."
"You should write a novel. The regular resource of people who don't go enough into the world to live a novel is to write one."
"I have done it,"
said Elfride, looking dubiously at Mrs. Swancourt, as if in doubt whether she would meet with ridicule there.
"That's right. Now then, what is it about, dear?"
Well, it is a romance of the Middle Ages."
Knowing nothing of the present age, which everybody knows about, for safety, you chose an age known neither to you nor other people. That's it, eh? No, I don't mean it, dear.
"Well, I have had some opportunities of studying medieval art and manners in the library and private museum at Endlestowe House, and I thought I should like to try my hand upon a fiction. I know the time for these tales is past, but I was interested in it, very much interested."
"When is it to appear?"
"Oh, never, I suppose."
"Nonsense, my dear girl. Publish it by all means. All ladies do that sort of thing now. Not for profit, you know, but as a guarantee of mental respectability to their future husbands."
"An excellent idea of us ladies."
"Though I'm afraid it rather resembles the melancholy ruse of throwing loaves over castle walls at besiegers, and suggests desperation rather than plenty inside."
"Did you ever try it?"
"No, I was too far gone even for that."
"Papa says no publisher will take my book."
"That remains to be proved. I'll give my word, my dear, that by this time next year it shall be printed."
"Will you, indeed?"
said Elfride, partially brightening with pleasure, though she was sad enough in her depths.
"I thought brains were the indispensable, even if the only, qualification for admission to the Republic of Letters. A mere commonplace creature like me will soon be turned out again."
"Oh, no. Once you are there, you'll be like a drop of water in a piece of rock crystal. Your medium will dignify your commonness."
"It will be of great satisfaction,"
Elfride murmured, and thought of Stephen, and wished she could make a great fortune by writing romances, and marry him and live happily.
"And then we'll go to London and then to Paris," said Mrs. Swancourt. "I have been talking to your father about it. But we have first to move into the manor house, and we think of staying at Torquay whilst that is going on. Meanwhile, instead of going on a honeymoon scamper by ourselves, we have come home to fetch you, and go all together to Bath for 2 or 3 weeks.
Elfride assented pleasantly, even gladly, but she saw that by this marriage her father and herself had ceased for ever to be the close relations they had been up to a few weeks ago. It was impossible now to tell him the tale of her wild elopement with Stephen Smith. He was still snugly housed in her heart. His absence had regained for him much of that aureola of saintship which had been nearly abstracted during her reproachful mood on that miserable journey from London. Rapture is often cooled by contact with its cause, especially if under awkward conditions, and that last experience with Stephen had done anything but make him shine in her eyes. His very kindness in letting her return was his offence. Elfriede had her sex's love of sheer force in a man, however ill-directed. And at that critical juncture in London, Stephen's only chance of retaining the ascendancy over her, that his face and not his parts had acquired for him, would have been by doing what, for one thing, he was too youthful to undertake. That was, dragging her by the wrist to the rails of some altar and peremptorily marrying her. Decisive action is seen by appreciative minds to be frequently objectless and sometimes fatal. But decision, however suicidal, has more charm for a woman than the most unequivocal Fabian success. However, some of the unpleasant accessories of that occasion were now out of sight again, and Stephen had resumed not a few of his fancy colours.